welcome to the B&B Q&A number 5. Just me and Barn today, and we plan to talk about unique selling points and the reason for picking us over somebody else, and also giving people out there a pointer as to what your unique selling points are, and try to elevate yourself from the crowd somehow. Apologies for missing last month's. We were actually snowed under last month with pitches. We did a pitch for a film, which sadly we didn't get, and also a crazy workload actually on a project that we're currently working on, which we're not allowed to talk about. But yeah, we're back this month, and we hope to really not miss many of these if we can really help it. So do apologise for that. Anyway, kicking off straight into it. Why work with us? What's our unique selling point? Why should somebody come to us rather than going to the next guy? It's a fiercely contested area, the area that we work in, and it's very hard to get work and maintain a client base and have them keep coming back to you. So why work with us? And one of the sort of commonly held beliefs is that each composer should find their own sound. And that's something we've toyed with over the years, something that we've thought about doing and discussed ways that we might be able to achieve that. And the thing is, it does work for composers at the top of the field. People like Hans Zimmer, Thomas Newman, Randy Newman, Danny Elfman, they all have their own sound. And when you hear a piece of music that's composed by those guys, you can pretty much have a firm and well-educated guess that it's them right from the get-go, even if you're not familiar with the score or that you've ever seen the film before. And Hans Zimmer's sound, I think of it as being, well, actually historically it was sort of that big taiko drum beat sound, really big epic sound. I think he's kind of morphed and evolved his sound a bit more these days. It's sort of more of an academic sort of approach with shepherd tones and even sort of minimalist style phase compositions, I suppose is the best way to describe it, where two lines gradually drift out of phase to create a sort of a mess, if you like, and then they drift back into phase again by just being played at slightly different BPMs. And I think he used that technique on Dunkirk, and it worked very, very well. How would you describe the sound of Thomas Newman, Barn?
Well, I mean, you've mentioned a few composers. I would also add something like John Williams. Things like, can you imagine a Star Wars film without his sound? Yes, I think it's one of those. For me, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Finding your own sound is a brilliant idea if it's a sound what people will want to come to you for, which is obviously the real key to it. So you're asking. But your question was, what defines Hans Zimmer's sound?
Thomas Newman.
Sorry, Thomas Newman. Thomas Newman's sound, I would think, what makes his sound unique is the way he does harmony, the way he works with counterpoint. And what I mean that is he will happily play two dissonant, well, what would seem to be two very dissonant chords over each other, but they work. Why did they work? Because it's Thomas Newman. It's the way he composes things. I mean, I could get quite academic about it, but he will happily play a major and a minor chord in the same key at the same time, which you genuinely don't do because it creates a dissonance. You've got the minor and the minor and the major third. But the way he does it, the way he moves between keys, becomes quite a distinctive sound, and it's become part of what makes it. He also likes to use a lot of pizzicato instruments, which are a lot of kind of percussive short noises, and he also has what I think is what I think is a particularly good thing he does is he chooses unusual instruments. He doesn't pick your classic sound palette. He'll go for something which is quite unique. It's not always the case. He'll sometimes just go with a standard full orchestra. I think the sound of Finding Nemo and so on and so forth is quite that. But the sound of Rota Perdition is a little bit more classical. And I think one of my favourite scores of his is from a film called Lemony Snicket. It's because it's got a very distinctive palette of sounds. I mean, incredibly simple themes, just played around with such unusual instruments, and this use of unusual counterpoint and chords which you wouldn't think would work together, but do, because he'll happily play a low single note, like a kind of a low, like a kind of a bass pedal, and then do blom 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 all over the top, which seems to be quite unusual, disparate chords, but because of the way he does it, it works. And now it's become a sound which people go for. So I would say that's what makes this an interesting topic to discuss, is why with that, finding your own sound. Now, I would also argue that finding your own sound is as much about making, well, I suppose the question is, making that sound as commercially viable as possible. I mean, I would say it's more so to do with picture, if you're doing stuff to do with picture, than doing if we're just becoming an artiste, creating your own material. Because if you're writing stuff to picture, you're more likely to be wanting to support whatever's going on in the picture, which might stand out a bit too much if the music you're writing is so avant-garde and so unusual, it would take away the interest from the picture. But in terms of doing, but aside from that, it's what works for you in terms of the notes you write, the instruments you choose, the way you produce, and the sounds you produce. Now, I would say that's kind of the three areas of production. Which one particular thing I think Hans Zimmer does very well is, I mean, I remember reading another interview when someone said he's not the best film composer in the world, but he's the best film music producer in the world. And I tend to largely agree with that, because he's always searching for a new sound. He's always saying, he's not going to sit there and go, I'm just going to use a classic orchestra in this, I'm going to do that. So he'll always try for something different and striving to find that unusual sound. He made a point on one of his interviews that he'll never use, if he gets a new synthesizer, be a virtual one or a physical one, he'll never write anything, he'll never release anything which is using a standard, a patch, a sound which comes with it, a preset. He'll always be interested in creating his own sounds for it. He has people, I mean, fortunately for him, he's got a time budget to do that. I think we're kind of getting a bit off topic here, but the amount of times I've watched something on television and I recognise the sound sources, largely because I know the time constraints that TV composers are under. But I won't listen to a Hans Zimmer score and go, I know where that's from, because the sounds he creates are all new. Whether that's the sound of like Krypton in Man of Steel, there's a quite a distinctive sort of plucked sound he used there, but I knew he created that from scratch. It was a lovely little sound.
But the thing is, I mean, what you're saying is not off topic, because in a way it's almost arguing the opposite side of it, and like not to have a kind of set sound that you go for. You know, that Hans Zimmer seems to be trying to break out of that, is what you're saying. And I guess really the reality is it's a sliding scale. You know, at the one extreme, you've got people who just stick to one sound and, you know, follow their formula. And then you've got people who are completely chameleon-like and always adapt and change their music to suit whatever the project is. But then you can't really necessarily pick out a piece of music that they wrote and say, I know you did that. I mean, it's, if you think of it as a big sliding scale with a big grey area in between, you know, maybe the optimal position is somewhere in the middle.
I would say, yeah, there's kind of arguments for both sides. Yeah, of course, when you get to the top of the game and people, I mean, unless you're very lucky in the world, you're going to be selling yourself. Unless you're very lucky and someone finds you and comes to you, wants your sound, you'll be putting yourself out there. So then you'll find yourself thinking, well, am I trying to create something which sounds like I can do what the others do, but, you know, with my sort of little twist on it? Am I trying to forge my own way here? Now, I'm familiar with, there are a few composers who've come from the pop world, I would say, or the more traditional music industry, and have made great waves in the film composing world. One of them, I would say, is most famous, who won the Oscar this year, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Their first film score won them an Oscar. I mean, it's the crazy thing in the world to think that that was literally their first attempt at writing a film score, and it won the Oscar. And that was for The Social Network. And why did it win the Oscar? Well, for two reasons. Atticus Ross is a very clever, more traditional orchestral kind of composer, but Trent Reznor was all about creating a new sound. So you mix these two things together, and you had this magic lightning in a bottle. They just won it again this year for Pixar's Soul, which again is a fabulous example of mixing traditional with the contemporary electronic in this case. And he's all about finding a sound. I forget the name of the guy who directed Social Network. I think it was actually Aaron Sorkin. He was waxing lyrical about one of the first cues that he wrote for Social Network, and it's a really basic piano. I forget the name of the track now. It's a really, really basic piano, like just kind of sparse chords, but with a crazy synth behind it. We're just like bling, bling, which is something YouTube would normally think I'll put together, but it works so well in selling Zuckerberg's, and the way he was feeling at that particular time in the film. You can see why it won. So in that instance, that was a case of a perfect combination of someone who is classically trained and works predominantly with orchestras and so on, and someone who has a completely different background.
But it sounds like what you're saying, though, that those guys don't really have a sound either, a sound specific to them. It's a sound for the film.
I would say it's a sound, but it's a sound which is unique. Well, to be fair, I haven't heard enough of their scores to really argue at this point. But I would say the reason that people come to them for this, I think, Pixar's Soul and Social Network both had music which featured this mixture of the traditional and the non-traditional. So my argument would be that people are likely to be coming to them because they want something which, as far as they're concerned, is a little different, but still fits the heavy, the emotional requirements of a film. And I think that's also the interesting point. It's like it's how well it works. Picture is so completely subjective. So I would argue that they have found a sound. Well, they found maybe not a sound, but at least a style that works for them.
A way of working, perhaps more than a specific sound.
Yeah, but an approach. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is, I mean, of course, if you go for a sound or a thematic approach or whatever it is that's your kind of USP, you're going to end up getting pigeonholed because that's basically what you do. And that works on some levels, and it's got pros and cons, just like anything. And I mean, if we just explore some of the advantages and disadvantages of approaching your compositions that way. I mean, one thing I'd say about getting pigeonholed, one of the big advantages is that clients will know why to call you because they know what your sound is. And if that happens to be appropriate for their particular project, then that's the reason they call you. It makes you individual. It makes people come to you rather than the next guy, just because you've got something unique to offer that somebody else doesn't have. And everyone's well aware of what that thing is that you offer. I'd also say that, if you're starting with a sort of a sound or an approach in mind, you don't start with a blank page. In any project, you've got some go-to sounds perhaps, or you know that you're going to write a theme because your approach is thematic, and of course what goes with that is if you do that on each and every project as you go, practice makes perfect, and the more and more you stick to your formula, the better you're going to get at writing it over time. But there's disadvantages that come with this. It limits your work potential, of course. That's probably the biggest. If you always work with orchestras, the moment somebody wants something more synthetic and artificial, they're not going to think of you. They're going to go to Trent Reznor. it also can limit the diversity of your work. So you end up with a big portfolio of music, perhaps, that all sounds a little bit samey. And of course, the other big issue from your own perspective is that it might be less satisfying to work with the same sound project after project after project. Actually, I think that's one thing that we enjoy, is the variety of the different things we're asked to do. And I do enjoy when someone says, I don't know, some sort of lounge jazz for this, and, you know, some hard rock for this. I'd actually really enjoy the challenge of stepping up and doing different things. It would be very hard to do that if you were trying to somehow conform to your sound. So there's lots of pros and cons. You got anything to add to that, Barn?
You pretty much nailed it on the head. My only comment to add would be, there's a yin and a yang of having your own sound. You might get more employed. I mean, I think sometimes people. So I mean, like I remember one director we worked with said to us, "You guys are a bit too eclectic. I don't quite know where to put you." And I remember thinking at the time, is that a good thing or was that a bad thing? I think the way he viewed it was as a bad thing. But sometimes there is also, I think there's a sort of an ongoing, if you look at the music that we've written in the last, 20, 30 years now, especially in the last 20 years when I'm doing Bob and Barn, there's been a common thread. I remember when a marketing guy I worked with many years, the lovely Philip Morley, he said he could listen to our music and know it's ours. Which I at the time was surprised, thinking like, how can you recognise a piece from Frogger related to Medieval and related to, they're so completely different. How would you? But he said, I can hear there's something in it which I recognise as your style. I thought that was a good thing. Thank you. But and what we've done over the years is, I say that we've started to kind of forge an interest, and if we're lucky enough, we can make this. You know, we can persuade the people we're working with that this is the sound for their project too. It's sort of developed. Initially, it started with a game called Kung Fu Chaos. That was a little game which is a lovely original Xbox game, which and the music we did was a mixture of actually funk and kung fu, and a bit of disco as well. As these four characters kick the shit out of each other on these badly recreated film sets. But one thing I found particularly fascinating with that is that when you start the game, you're in a dojo in China. And we wanted to make the music sound authentic, so therefore, I remember at the time, this is back in 2002, Googling Chinese music, and we found ChineseMusic.co.uk, a lovely guy, a chap called Li Jiang, who introduced us to the world of recording real Chinese instruments, either instruments players over here in the UK, or ones actually over in China. And it was a lovely experience hearing it all to come together, especially back in those days. Having samples of authentic sounding samples of those particular instruments was quite hard to come by, and any sounds we had on our synth just sounded absolutely nuts. It sounded so synthetic it was never going to work. But there's a sound, I think Bob and I will both, Bob will agree with this, when we discovered the sound of the erhu, ERHU. It's a Chinese violin. It's something which I've seen being played in Soho before and in Chinatown. It's hard to describe really, but it's like a single instrument with the top and kind of box to bottom, and the guy plays it by sort of applying pressure on certain parts on the string, which will create the notes. It's a monophonic sound, but it's beautiful. It's so expressive. And I remember when he first heard it, I was like, this is an amazing thing. So we clocked that for later. Then a couple of years later, we had another project which had a similar sort of ethnic requirement, and we started realising that we quite like the sound of world music, which is a little bit of kind of all-encompassing thing. But it's that thing when you start to explore. This is even back in the mid-noughties when even Wikipedia was just a sort of a vague idea, but looking at instruments from a native country and exploring it and trying to find out whether we can find players to do this. We applied this to a game, which, to be fair, was more medieval instruments, for a game called Neverwinter Nights, where we found a selection of players who could play authentic instruments. And it came together in, but then it also really came together for a game called Sega Rally, where we started recording some ethnic instruments for that. And then a couple of years later, we did a game called Brink, which is kind of where it kind of culminated for me as the kind of the pinnacle of what we wanted to achieve, and that was to mix an orchestra with a ton of electronics, with a ton of live, unusual ethnic instruments, and also, in this case, like the best part of 30 percussion instruments. So we discovered that our sound was a mixture of the word fusion is a bit overrated, but it's a fusion of the world music sound with a more cerebral, maybe more slightly sizable, maybe an orchestra, maybe some kind of scratch band of unusual instruments. But it's bringing that unusual lead instruments over something normally quite big and weighty. And in the last few years, we managed to use this. We did a film called MSND, which is Midsummer Night's Dream, which sadly hasn't been released yet. Our first Shakespeare film, and recorded lots of wonderful ethnic instruments for that. I think one of the reasons why we got the project in the first place is because we talked to the director about how once the setting of the film moves away from Athens, the military, and it goes into the forest where you meet up with all the fairies and everything else. I said it should go from a more military sound to a much more acoustic, organic sound. And in that instance, it was literally a case of finding different instruments, unusual ethnic instruments for each of the characters, like Oberon and Tatiana, and so on and so forth. And a year before that, we did a game called Riggs, which was our first VR game for Sony. And because Riggs was a mechanized combat league, it was basically a sports game in different arenas around the world. Once we knew where the arenas were, we did the same thing, looked up the instruments, managed to record an air who for it, and a few other instruments. So each area was musically localized to using instruments which were authentic from where they were from. I've talked far too much. I'll let Bob take over now.
Well, one thing I wanted to get onto was, what actually happens in practice. I mean, all of this is great in theory, and we can sit and talk and procrastinate about it. We want to have our own sound, but we're being asked to do other things and so on, or we don't want our own sound. Everyone has a different approach, but what actually happens in practice? And what we found, I think, over the years, or certainly I can speak from my perspective, I'm sure you'll share the same sentiment, though, Barn, is that unless you're an established artist already, most often you're asked to parody other composers anyway, because they've probably got a temp score, and, after a certain period of time, if the temp score's been in place for a while, people start to get very married to that, and it's almost impossible then to beat it. I remember hearing Jerry Goldsmith talking about that exact thing, where a piece of his music had been used in a temp score, and he was writing the music for this film, and they kept asking him to make it closer and closer to the temp, his own music. He's sort of laughing in the end, saying, "Why don't you just license that?" And it's kind of weird, really, how that can work. So I think in practice, certainly from my perspective, I know I enjoy writing in different styles and the variety of styles that we're often asked to write in. I think it's wonderful, actually, and I don't think I'd want to prescribe our sound so much that we wouldn't have the opportunity to explore uncharted waters musically. I think that's great fun. And as you said earlier, Barn, people have said that despite the variety of our music, not just Philip Morley, but quite a few of my friends have said that they can recognize our sound across different genres. It's kind of curious because I'm not sure what our sound is, which is madness to say. But the truth is, I don't really know what it is. I don't know what it is that makes one of our tracks recognizable to these people. I'm glad that it does, but maybe one day we should sit down and figure out just what it is that makes our sound, if indeed we have it. Because we certainly have never sat down and said, right, this is going to be our sound and we're sticking to it. We've had some discussions about that, but it's never really happened.
I would say go on. I was going to jump in and say one thing here is that actually recently, or come to something later, I was reviewing the soundtrack we've just done for, we had a couple of projects out in the last month, and Me, Myself and Die, and I hear stuff, especially in your cues later on, which totally reminded me of stuff from, what was it? I think bits of Primal, some others. Yeah, I heard certain progressions which I thought, that's totally you. That's totally a thing you would do. So I think from that perspective, there's two things here. There's the choice of instruments that we use and the notes that we write on the page. And I think the notes we write on the page, quite often we will fall back onto into tropes that we ourselves, that we both like writing. And I definitely we've used that a few times. So I can definitely say that there's a few of our scores now I think, oh, that bit's from Star Down, that bit's from Primal, that's from Medieval. I'm hearing all of that, just me, myself and Die. So for me, I think there is a style of writing that we have got used to doing, and hopefully it's...
I mean, that's a discussion in itself, because you could say, oh, we're not being creative enough, not being original enough, we're ripping ourselves off. And I remember hearing a piece of James Horner music, actually, and I just went to the cinema, watched the movie, didn't know that Horner had scored it, and then I heard this little piano motif, and I can't even remember which film it was now, but I heard this little piano motif that reminded me very much of his score from, and I'm not going to be able to remember the film now, but it was one of those post-apocalypse things with a meteorite hitting the Earth. Can you remember the name?
Wasn't that Deep Impact?
Yes, I think it was Deep Impact. And I just remember here. Yes, it was. Now you've said it, and I remember there's a really nice little piano motif that he used in one of the main themes on that, and I loved it. And I actually sat down and worked it out on the piano because I liked it so much. And this little piano motif came on, and I thought, oh my God, it sounds almost exactly the same as that one from Deep Impact. Sure enough, see the credits at the end, James Horner wrote it. And so, it's not unique just to us. I mean, everybody kind of does it. And if you think about it, you're a product of all of your influences in life. And, of course, you're going to end up reaching for the same kind of chord progressions, or perhaps the same style of melody. And sometimes you have to break yourself out of that. But at the same time, it's quite desirable, because if it is one of those things that gives you a sound, gives you an identity, that's not entirely unwanted.
I would jump in and say I remember this reminded me of a story of actually I wasn't even there. I think you were there. It happens not obviously with many creatives. People want them for what they want to say. We recorded Tom Baker for the voiceover on Medieval Resurrection. And we wanted Tom Baker to be Tom Baker. But Tom Baker didn't want to be Tom Baker. He's fed up with being Tom Baker. He wants to be something. He wants to be something he isn't. But he was frustrated because people just hire him because they want him to sound doing his sound. Whether it's a bit of Little Britain at the time, I think was the most popular thing. But he wanted to do something different. But he was so well known for being Tom Baker. That's what people hired him for. I remember seeing a similar thing. There was a Graham Norton thing on where he had all the pythons on the sofa, and Cleves was pointing out that we've done these jokes for, but that's all they want to see. They want anything new. They want the old material we did 40 years ago, and that's what we have to give them. And it's true. It is. I mean, on my little duo touring with John Hare, they want to hear Cannon Fodder. They want to hear Sensible Soccer. They want to hear the tracks they know from the games. They don't want to hear the new stuff. They don't want to hear new songs he's written. No, they want to hear that because that's what they're there for. Anyway, we are getting a little bit sidetracked.
Well, I'd say one thing about, just to round off that thing. I think from my perspective anyway, we're probably not yet a big enough name to be able to say, right, we're going to create our sound and people will come to us for that. And as we've already said, maybe that's not entirely desirable anyway. I think maybe you can tailor your sound as the more successful you become, the more well known your brand becomes. Maybe then you have an opportunity to tailor your sound and be more specific perhaps about it. But I think until then, from my point of view, I think keeping the work that we do varied and not always going for the same kind of thing will be creatively more interesting, and of course keep the amount of work on the table, keep the number of jobs available to us high, rather than limiting our potential.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the what's either been released in the last month of ours, which has actually been, and what we've worked on the last month, they're kind of four very, very disparate, varied, very, enormously varied projects. We've already mentioned we pitched on a film to get it, but because actually they wanted more. It's musical sound design. They wanted the sound of war for manipulated sounds. So that was definitely a far cry from then. In the last month, we've been to we've actually had 2 trips. We've had 2 things released. Went to our first film premiere in a couple of years. I went to watch Me, Myself and Die at a cinema in Bolton, of all places, and but the score itself, which is will be coming out as a soundtrack on this Friday, it's a romantic, it's a rom-com score with a northern brass band with a string section and woodwinds and so on and so forth to help with the romance side of it. And because she likes bang, we've got a sitar at the end. So it's a very, very different from what we've just worked from the pitch. Then we had a few weeks before that, we had our first documentary come out on Netflix, which is called Hating Peter Tatchell. Which again, it's a very, very different sound. It does have live strings. That's probably the only similarity in it. But it's a documentary covering the life of effectively the world's most highest profile gay rights activist. So in terms of the writing of the score, it's a very, very different approach. There's much more rhythmic stuff. There's much more much more electronics in it. But yeah, it was a very, very different score. And what we're currently working on, which we can't discuss, is it's actually it's a more electronic with a kind of a rocky edge to it as well. So varied, but as Bob said, we love the variety. It would be boring for us to write the same thing all the time. But we might be more, might be wealthy or more prolific or more high profile if we did. But I suppose from our perspective, we chose to go down the route of a variety of scores because for me, and I know for us, it was more creatively satisfying. If you think about the projects we did the last couple of years, in 2019 we had. Is that a plane going over your head in your house?
I believe it is. Yeah.
Oh, that's so loud. We did quiz show score. We were writing the score for this film. We had music for Richard Osman's Work Up of the Decade. Again, TV sort of show, magazine, hugely varied styles of music. And the project which came out on TV earlier this year, Dead Pixels. Just the variety of the work within that one project was enormously satisfying.